Welcome to this special edition of Hub Hits. I'm Theo Argitis, the Hub's editor-at-large for business and economics, and I'm pleased to have here with us Kevin Quigley, director of the MacEachen Institute for Public Policy and Governance, and a professor in the Department of Public and International Affairs at Dalhousie University. We will be talking about Professor Quigley's new book, which has the title Seized by Uncertainty: The Markets, Media, and Special Interests That Shaped Canada's Response to COVID-19. The book has been shortlisted for the Donner Book Prize. The prize is meant to encourage an open exchange of ideas and to provide a springboard for Canadian authors making original and meaningful contributions to policy discourse. The Hub is proud to be partnering with the Donner Canadian Foundation to spotlight the 5 shortlisted titles and their authors in this special series. Professor Quigley co-wrote the book with research assistants at MacEachen. I'll name them here: Caitlin Lowe, Sarah Moore, and Brianna Wolf. It's a deep dive into Canada's response to the COVID crisis. The authors argue that Canada's response was limited and that institutional inertia could prevent us from learning the right lessons from the pandemic. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us on Hub Hits.
Thanks, Theo, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So what were the right lessons then from the pandemic, and why do you think we may struggle to learn from them?
I think that the book is structured in a way that looks at how the government established a control mechanism to understand and respond to the pandemic, and then it looks at the contextual issues that shaped and influenced the way the government responded. So we look at the legal context, the role of the insurance industry, private public insurance, media, public opinion, and the role of concentrated interests and how they shape the influence. So to a certain extent, it's a book that documents a highly fluid dynamic that documents government reactions that sometimes were rational, sometimes quite irrational, kind of depending on what your frame of reference is, whether we're motivated by kind of irrational orientation or emotions and the way people perceived the threat. And that kind of fluid dynamic led to, in some ways, maybe a narrow focus on one particular dimension of this problem, but didn't fully account for the interdependencies and the cascading impacts of the intervention it was going to take.
I mean, so what do you mean by this kind of narrow intervention, and what would have been an ideal response in your opinion?
Sure, I
given
hate to
given the
answer a
kind
question
of
on an ideal response. In the conclusion, I will say we say right up front, we don't blame anybody for what they did, but we hope they don't do it twice. This sort of, obviously, it was a highly challenging risk. I mean, I look at low probability, high consequence events, and that's what I've done throughout my career. So when you don't have the probability data, when you don't actually know what's going to happen, you're led towards certain responses that aren't always all that rational. But we don't necessarily want to just engage in revisionism and pretending something wasn't a serious problem when it was. But maybe what I would say is this. I think when I think about the different types of risk that you deal with in a problem like this, I would characterize them in 3 different ways. Complex risks, which are about the science; uncertainty, how we address uncertainty when we don't have the science; and then ambiguity, which is to say when the politics and the values are in conflict. So let me just take the 3 of those points and try to highlight some things that the book observes. When we're dealing with complex risks, we're talking about how do we come up with rigorous science. And I think in some respects during the pandemic, we had access to a plethora of data actually around the world that was being updated in nanoseconds, which was fantastic. But actually getting meaningful, context-sensitive data at the right time and interpreting it properly was much more problematic. I think also scientists had a hard time sometimes explaining the limits of science. So I think we need to be clear about to what extent are our policies being shaped by science, and to what extent are there limitations, and actually we're making assumptions about the way that we're using science. When we talk about follow the science or trust the science, I think we're actually talking about trust the scientists. So I think the scientists have an obligation to make sure that not only is their research rigorous, but they need people to explain the limits of what they know. So I think that's an important observation on the role of science. When we talk about uncertain risks, we're talking about when we don't have sufficient data, predictive data, to know where we're going. And I think in the early stages, in particular with the pandemic, we just didn't know how big this was going to get. Was it going to be really devastating or not? When you're dealing with a risk that's highly consequential and potentially catastrophic and unknown, we're drawn towards precautionary approaches. Precaution was a term used frequently by the government. The problem with precautionary approaches is they can be enormously expensive and they can be very narrow. So getting back to your point about what do we mean about maybe our narrow approaches, a precautionary approach can get fixated on a particular risk problem. And in this case, we were really thinking about largely about containment or slowing the spread of the disease without necessarily recognizing that that was a very aggressive strategy that was going to have a number of impacts across society, economic impacts, mental health impacts, different impacts on different demographic groups by applying a very, very high standard to try to contain the disease. And this relates to the third point, which is about ambiguous risk. After a period of time, we started to see more conflict based on different worldviews, whether people were feeling like the response was excessive, the government's role was excessive. We saw this in the protests, for instance, that were in Ottawa, Parliament Hill. We didn't see, and actually it was the case also that the pandemic impacted young people different than did older people. It had a devastating impact on certain racialized minorities, indigenous communities. We were not particularly well equipped in that particular moment in time to build a stronger consensus and be more tolerant of different views and debate. I think the sort of at first there was a sort of urgency to the issue, but as time went on, people's tolerance for the government's response started to fray, and there started to be more tension, and it seemed the government was ill-equipped to be able to accommodate a diversity of views.
So just the challenge or the problem was that they were just focused on too narrow a set of parameters or variables. They should have kind of had a broader set of parameters in mind. For example, mental health or just democratic principles, for example. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
I think that's one of the risks with a precautionary approach. If your goal is a particular goal like containing the disease, and that seemed to be the government's concern, public health's concern in the early stages, and they held that position for quite some time. I don't think they were fully aware of the interdependencies of that position and the consequences. So it could be about mental health. But another issue, for instance, is also the relative neglect of a lot of other policy issues. When you think of a lot of the policy issues we're dealing with today about, immigration, affordability, cost of living, things like that, a lot of those things were just sidelined. Climate change as well. Not a lot of discussion on those issues for like 2 year period of time. Like there's only so much bandwidth the government has to address certain issues. So they're going to absolutely wholly sort of fixate on one particular issue in such a strong way. There's going to be consequence to that. Some things are going to be overlooked. We tend to overlook trade-offs and the unintended consequences, I suppose, of the policies we adopt when we have these sort of strong precautionary approaches. Precautionary approaches are very expensive ways to do business.
And is that a capacity thing in our institutions, or is it a leadership thing, or something deeper, kind of a deeper issue? Like why
Yeah.
did we fail in that
Yeah.
sense?
So I think it's part of the broader social context. One of the things is that we have quite an extensive study of the media coverage that occurred during the pandemic. Um, I think that the media coverage amplified the risk in a certain way. It's what we would call a high dread risk because of a high level of uncertainty and a lot of anxiety about the threat. I remember somebody coming over to my house once and saying, she was an older woman, and she said, I'm so worried. I'm worried that I could just touch something and get it and die. And I thought, wow, imagine feeling, but some people felt that way, but imagine feeling that way. How do you get out of bed in the morning? I mean, there are threats and risks if you get out of bed in the morning. There are threats and risks if you don't get out of bed in the morning. There is no risk-free option. We have to live with a certain amount of risk and uncertainty. This was a highly uncertain risk. We didn't know where it was going, but it had the characteristics to generate a lot of anxiety in the population to start with. Risk psychologists will say this was a high dread risk, had the characteristics to really freak everybody out. And then you have a media that amplifies those kind of issues without necessarily, particularly later in the process, of focusing on the probability of the issue. So we will call that probability neglect. Psychologists will call it probability neglect when you only talk about the consequence, but you don't actually talk about the likelihood of it happening. So it was a
Yeah.
highly amplified risk and it was high dread. But one of the things we do in the book, for example, is we compare deaths during COVID-19 to, say, road deaths. It was also compared to a wartime situation. So we compare it to the war. And in the case of the First and Second World War, it was much more devastating than COVID-19. In case of road deaths, um, if you look over a 10-year time horizon, we tolerate a lot of road deaths every year. About 2,000 people a year die on the road. And a lot of those people are young people, right? So why was it there was this sort of highly, amplified, anxious response to this problem at this particular moment in time? And how do we justify how long we held that containment strategy, I suppose? So I guess my short answer would be this, that it happens in a broad social context. It's partly about human reaction to risk and uncertainty. It's partly about media amplification. And then a government that responds to that in a kind of whack-a-mole format where it's dealing with today's crisis, but not necessarily thinking downstream. And a bureaucracy that's largely rewarded for dealing with the dangers and threats and risks of today, but they're not necessarily rewarded for the risks they've already addressed or the risks that might come next year.
Yeah. And so how do you, actually want to ask you as well about the markets and the special interests part of your title.
Hmm.
But I mean, how do you, as a journalist, I'm curious, how do you correct the kind of the media amplification problem?
Yeah, so I think that that's a good question. I think that one thing we have to be always clear about is the probability part of the problem, and not just the consequence part. So when we look at the coverage throughout the pandemic, what we saw was that the media coverage was extremely high at the beginning and remained pretty high throughout. When death rates went up and down and up and down, the media coverage didn't necessarily change. And then ironically, after about 18 months and then into 2 years, you really start to see a drop in media coverage. And in Nova Scotia, our death count was going up. So the death count's going up, but the media coverage is going down. So there's something about the novelty of it as well that sort of generates a certain amount of interest. And also, of course, the media is communicating to people, this is how you need to act and react in light of this threat. So they're doing a kind of public service role, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that with these kind of low probability events, we always have to be aware of what is the probability and how do we communicate the science to people as clearly as possible so it doesn't maybe unnecessarily generate more anxiety. I think we need to also be recognize that there were a number of issues, and this is an interesting issue on the demographic side, that there are a number of, when you think about the priorities of people under 40, like affordability, housing, jobs, immigration, things like that, a lot of those issues just fell off um, the radar on the media. They just simply didn't get the coverage. So are we really, once we start assigning journalists to cover these stories, and we know it's a story that has some duration, and the pandemic would, then you could cover that story for a long time. And everybody, particularly that first summer, there was always a new pandemic angle that was coming up. But should we be thinking more about how we balance the media coverage and think about other issues that are also of concern, or the things that are being neglected as a result of the intense focus?
You also talk about markets and special interests. Can you just elaborate what you mean in both instances?
Sure. So when we look at the market dynamics, we look at, who made money, who didn't make money during the pandemic. The pharmaceutical industry, of course, made a lot of money, also improved its reputation quite a bit. Big box stores made a lot of money because they could follow health directives because they were so large. They could sell a lot of products, but smaller businesses, as a result, had to close down. We have a case study on tourism. Tourism was absolutely devastated during the pandemic, the highest unemployment rate of all the sectors. And in fact, when we think about tourism, tourism employs it's a lot of low income work. It's a lot of vulnerable populations, a lot of young people who work in tourism, totally devastated. Cruise industry, my neck of the woods in Nova Scotia, totally devastated. Tourism, let me just make this comment about tourism. With tourism, something like Air Canada, for instance, critical infrastructure, very organized lobby, and offering a critical service that has to be protected. Most national airlines were protected by Western governments, and Air Canada Although, it took a while for them to negotiate a deal. Eventually, Air Canada got a very, very generous amount of support from the Canadian government. But that's one dimension. But 99% of tourism businesses are small and medium-sized enterprises. As I say, they employ they're low-income jobs disproportionately. They employ a lot of vulnerable populations, and that was the highest unemployment rate. And in fact, tourism employs 10% of the population in Canada and in the world. It's a very big sector, but very, very vulnerable to the ups and downs of the economy or crises or disasters. So I would say generally when we think about the markets, big box shops did well. Groups that had good access to government did generally well and good lobbying capacity. Smaller businesses were much more vulnerable. A couple other points I'd make about the market dynamic. When we look at markets, we also think about the role of insurance. The insurance industry actually made a lot of money during the pandemic, but their policies were largely ineffective for protecting us. Of course, insurance is supposed to be the kind of repository of our funds to manage certain risks in society, but in this case, insurance really was not really able to meet the moment. Business continuity insurance was largely described as invalid. And then, as I say, ironically, the industry made a lot of money. We also look at work at home as an option, as an opt-out strategy for the market. A lot of people work from home, about 40% of the population worked from home. But when you look at who worked from home, it disproportionately benefited educated middle-class folks. People who were in low-income jobs, service delivery jobs, disproportionately had to go to work. Oftentimes they didn't have benefits, sick benefits, and they were, in that sense, even made more vulnerable during a time of crisis. I think that there were some interesting and troubling revelations during that about the market dynamics and who actually paid the price during the pandemic and who was more vulnerable without benefits and protections. That's on the market side. I can go on about the special interests as well. I comment about the special interests if you'd like, but it's largely about.
Why don't you give
Sure.
us an
I would
example
say
of that? Yeah.
Sure. The book looks at two different dimensions to special interests. One's working inside government, one's working outside government. I think on outside of government, when we're thinking about special interests, we're talking about groups like Air Canada, large companies that have lobbying capacity, offering a critical service that can make a persuasive case about why they need to be protected. And those industries disproportionately were. Smaller businesses were made more vulnerable. So access, lobbying, things like that. I think made a difference. Big box shops did a lot better. Grocery stores did very well also because they were offering important services that we needed, and they had the infrastructure that allowed them to do it. And they also had the cash reserves. They could secure the PPE and whatnot. So there wasn't necessarily anything untoward about it, but it's just a kind of natural dynamic that occurs when you are able to make a case about why your store should be open. You're able to lobby. You have the extra cash to build PPE, access PPE, build protective dimensions to your shop, and you offer a lot of services at your shop, then you can stay open. Small businesses had a much harder time. I think that on inside government, we look at public health, the role of public health. And as I mentioned earlier, I think that with public health, the public service really doesn't seem to have the same kind of incentives to prepare for these low probability, high consequence events. We saw evidence really of neglect when it came to preparing for a pandemic in terms of the state of the PPE, their ability to coordinate and act fast, their ability to access reliable information, impose high standards early on. I mean, most people would describe February 2020, a key month in the development of the pandemic, the emergence of the pandemic, strong signals coming from China. This was going to be a problem. February is described as the lost month, where most Western governments just failed to act in the face of what was clearly an emerging threat.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, I had done some polling just around the convoy, and just you mentioned remote work, the ability to work remote from home. If you looked at the polling at the time during the convoy and you saw the sort of demographics that supported the convoys, it was largely people who weren't able to work from home, people who actually had to go to work every day during the pandemic. I want to
We
just
talk a lot. I'll just mention some of the trucking, because the trucking convoy is an excellent example of the interest groups. Because when you compare something like Air Canada, where you have strong lobbying capacity, lawyers and lobbyists, and very big increase in lobby activity, But the trucking industry is highly fragmented. There's not huge corporations that own that industry. There's a number of small service providers. They weren't very well organized. They didn't necessarily understand how government worked. And of course, at the beginning of the story was about a little guy coming to bring his message to Ottawa. And then clearly the government was not particularly well equipped to deal with it. And it got more serious as time went on. And then an embarrassment for the government, then economic consequences. And then the government kind of comes down with the hammer. But it's true that there were mixed messages, I think, on generally about how people felt. I think on the one hand, people felt that they didn't necessarily support the kind of charade that was going on, the circus that was going on in Ottawa, but there was sympathy for people who were losing income for sure. And the truth was, in some jurisdictions in the Western world and in Western Canada, they were rolling back restrictions. So how much longer could government really hold such high standards if the standards were rolling back in other jurisdictions? And in fact, when you think about it, that occurred in that kind of January, February 2022 period. But by the end of March, a lot of the restrictions were lifted. So the truckers weren't necessarily too far away from where things were going.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a spillover from the election just a few months earlier, I think, what we saw. The just final question, Kevin. The how did Canada rank internationally? Like, were we notably worse than peer countries? I mean, how would you say
Mhm.
we did internationally,
I think that,
relatively speaking?
sure, I think what you find in Canada is that we had a very, very high vaccination rate. We had a relatively low death rate. We also spent a lot of money, more so than others, particularly in like programs like CERB, for example. Yeah, in the early stages, I think that's the way I would summarize Canada. They did well on the health side in terms of containment. Um, they spent a lot of money.
All right. Well, on that note, Kevin, thank you for joining us on Hub Hits, and thanks to all of you for listening.